The America's Democrats podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, is made possible by contributions from our listeners. Want to do more? Go to americasdemocrats.org and click Donate. And thank you for allowing us to be your voice. And if you enjoy the show, please share it with your friends on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. This week, mothers take on the gun lobby, plus how a wave of teachers' strikes in red state America is changing the political landscape. And on his new podcast, Bill Press talks impeachment with Representative Jamie Raskin. Had enough of Fox News, the House Freedom Caucus, and Donald Trump? If you want the facts that you won't get from them or from the fake news sites of the alt-right, then stay tuned. Our sponsor, 21st Century Democrats, works hard to get everyday Democrats involved in returning our party to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Sit back and listen, then stand up and fight. And follow 21st Century Democrats on Facebook for all the latest progressive news. We're glad you could join us. In the wake of the massacre at Sandy Hook, Shannon Watts started a movement. Built on the fundamentals of grassroots organizing and the unstoppable power of mothers, Moms Demand Action for Gun Sense in America now has 6 million supporters nationwide, with chapters in all 50 states. In her new book, she tells the story of its success. And we say hello to Shannon Watts, a mother of 5 and the founder of Moms Demand Action. She's also the author of Fight Like a Mother, How a Grassroots Movement Took on the Gun Lobby and Why Women Will Change the World. Shannon Watts, thank you so much for joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Well, our pleasure to have you with us. Let's start with Moms Demand Action. Tell us a bit about the organization.
So I started Moms Demand Action in December of 2012, just after the horrific tragedy at Sandy Hook School, because I thought intuitively that moms were the yin to the gun lobby's yang, and that we needed to organize like Mothers Against Drunk Driving, but for gun safety. And I started a Facebook page thinking we'd really just have an online conversation. I was a stay-at-home mom in Indiana, and I really wasn't that social media savvy. But what happened was that thousands of other women and moms had the same idea that day, and we very quickly began organizing, and that online conversation turned into one of the largest offline grassroots movements in the country.
Obviously, every organization has an origin story. Yours starts with a Facebook posting. Tell us about that first Facebook posting and what happened.
You know, I didn't know anything about organizing or gun laws. I only knew that our nation was broken because within hours after the Sandy Hook shooting, pundits were on my television saying the solution was more guns. So I went to Facebook, created this page, and my post was something like, we needed a march on Washington. Again, not knowing much about organizing, I thought, okay, we need to have one big event. But what became very clear very quickly was that we actually needed to organize on the ground and create a political powerhouse that could go toe-to-toe with the gun lobby.
This is obviously a book and a movement aimed at women. What is the unique role of moms and women in this movement, and what do they bring?
Women are the de facto caretakers of our communities. I believe that we are the secret sauce to organizing. Women have been on the front lines since Prohibition, all the way up through the water crisis in Flint, Michigan. And when women get involved, especially busy women, things get done. Social issues start to move. And frankly, that is in part because the vast majority of lawmakers in this country are men. And we have certain levers of power that we can pull as women and as moms. We are the majority of the voting electorate. We make 80% of the spending decisions for our families. And when we start to pull those levers of power, we see change happen. And Moms Demand Action is a really good example of that.
Yeah, and I should point out, Fight Like a Mother, it's also a book about grassroots activism. When you started, is that how you imagined this movement would unfold?
Absolutely not. I really had no idea what I was doing when I started that Facebook page. But what was amazing was that so many women gave me their time and their talents to really get this off the ground because they were afraid for their children and their safety. And when that happens, women realize they have nothing left to lose. They have to get off the sidelines. They have to get involved. And those first few months, we spent organizing to pass a bill at the federal level called Manchin Toomey. It was a bipartisan bill that would have closed the background check loophole in America. And just a few months after Sandy Hook, that bill failed by a handful of votes in the Senate. And I think we wondered if our work was done, if America just wasn't ready for this movement, and we would maybe give up. And what happened was that women, type A women in particular, just intuitively pivoted and started doing this work in state houses and in boardrooms where they lived, in their communities. And it worked. There were governors that were willing to act in the wake of Sandy Hook, even if Congress wouldn't. And so we passed stronger gun laws, but also we realized we had to play defense because the gun lobby works to pass such horrific, dangerous gun laws all the time at the state level. And we've become very good at defense. We have about a 90% track record of killing bad bills every single year in state houses. And on top of that, we realized we would have to get influencers like CEOs off the sidelines and get them involved in this issue too. So getting into boardrooms, going into businesses and asking these companies to have gun sense policies. So all of that work really will build momentum on the ground that points the president and Congress eventually in the right direction.
We're speaking with Shannon Watts, founder of Moms Demand Action, author of Fight Like a Mother, How a Grassroots Movement Took on the Gun Lobby and Why Women Will Change the World. Shannon, as 2020 approaches, we're heading into obviously an intense period of political activism. What is your advice as the best way to focus that energy?
Well, there are very important elections, even just in 2019. Virginia, every single seat in the assembly is up for election. So we will be very active on the ground there. We are hoping to flip Virginia to be a gun sense majority, but also getting ready for the 2020 elections, extremely excited to see that every single candidate, including the only Republicans so far to primary the president, all support gun safety. In fact, they're competing to see who can be the best on this issue, and that is a sea change in American politics. We have something called a gun sense candidate distinction. Right now, we're handing those questionnaires out to candidates, including presidential candidates, so we can see where they stand on this issue, and then we will make endorsements down the road accordingly. But everyone should get off the sidelines and get involved, know where your candidates stand on this issue, and make it a voting issue, because nothing will change until we vote in gun sense majorities everywhere.
You know, something else about Moms Demand Action, the organization has mastered the art of branding. What is the brand you've created, and what do you want to tell our listeners about how to create a brand? That, I didn't bring a ton of skills to the table, but that was one skill set I had, having been in corporate communications for many years and working at companies like General Electric, where brand is so important to selling products. And branding is just as important for activism. People want to belong to an organization that represents them and empowers them and emboldens them. And we show up in our red T-shirts all over the country, and that's our known signature color. When you see dozens or even hundreds of Moms Demand Action volunteers in state houses, you know why we're there. And some lawmakers fear that, but some welcome it and actually want us to stand with them. But also our volunteers even get tattoos of our logo. And really what we've created, even though we are mothers and others, we're not just women or just moms, but we've created this sisterhood, this tribe across the country, even in the reddest of states, where we come together and work on the sole purpose of saving lives. And that brand has been everything for the success of our organization. Well, and yours is also a success story about what we now refer to as hashtag activism. You've called social media both a blessing and a curse, and I'd have to be right there with you on that one. What have you learned about the upside of social media and how to avoid the downside?
Well, hashtag activism sometimes gets derided, but it is incredibly important, especially for busy moms who maybe only have nap time to carve out to engage in activism. And look, we were able to get Chipotle, for example, to stop allowing open carry inside their stores in just a weekend using the hashtag burritos, not bullets. So it does work. And the other thing that's so important about social media, especially for middle-aged women and women of color, is that it helps us bypass the gatekeepers who keep us from telling our stories. Many of the pundits and the anchors are men, and they're not that interested in telling the stories of a large section of American women. So we don't have to wait for them to have us on their shows or to allow us to tell our stories. We can tell them ourselves. And I think that has served such an important purpose to highlight the activism of our volunteers on the ground in places like Alabama and Nebraska and Kansas, where they wouldn't necessarily have a spotlight shown on them. That said, there's also the other side of social media, which is that it enables and sometimes even encourages horrible polarization and threats and threatened violence that can materialize offline as well. So it is a double-edged sword, and it's important to know how to navigate it. And I talk about that in my book.
Mm-hmm. Now, Moms Demand Action has been called both a political and cultural movement. What is the cultural change that you're hoping to inspire?
Yeah, this is not just about legislation or even corporate policies. This is also about changing America's culture of gun violence. And an example of that would be a program we have called Be Smart. And Be Smart is a non-polarizing way to talk about responsible gun storage. 4.5 million children in this country live in homes with unsecured guns, meaning they're not locked, they're loaded, they're easily accessible. And that's why we're the only high-income country that has a crisis in which children are able to obtain guns and hurt themselves or others. So we talk a lot about asking when you send your children over to friends and families' homes about how guns are secured and stored. We also work with a PTA across the country to get this information in the hands of parents and teachers, because mass shootings that occur at schools often happen when children have easy access to guns in their homes. That's one horrific outcome of easy access to guns. So all of that is cultural. Really, the NRA has eroded the responsibilities that go along with gun rights, and we are trying to restore them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's extremely important to understand. It's just about being safe. That's what it's all the message we're trying to get through here.
Right.
We're speaking with Shannon Watts, founder of Moms Demand Action and author of Fight Like a Mother: How a Grassroots Movement Took on the Gun Lobby and Why Women Will Change the World. Shannon, the book can be described as a how-to manual for movement building. We obviously don't have the time to go over all the skills that you wrote about in the book, but in the time that we do have, what are some of the most important skills that you could share?
Well, you have to know how to negotiate. We're a nonpartisan organization, and we do have to reach across the aisle and change hearts and minds, because these laws are about saving lives, and we really do need everyone on board. A perfect example of that is the fact that we were able to pass stronger gun laws last year in 20 states, 9 of which were signed by Republican governors. And so being open to not just unelecting some of these lawmakers, but changing their hearts and minds. Also, it's such an important point that women often fear failure. They feel they have to be perfect. And I talk about building the plane as we flew it in this book. We didn't wait to be experts. We didn't wait until we had all of the T's crossed and the I's dotted. We just jumped in and started working on this, knowing and trusting that we could build the plane as we flew it, and we did. We have failed. And I also talk about how failure is really feedback in the book. There's a whole chapter about losing forward. When you get involved in activism, you are going to lose. But how you take those losses and turn them into wins. Each battle teaches you how to win the next one, so that eventually you win the war. And an example of this in the book is in Arkansas. Arkansas was a really tough place to organize. We finally were able to do that after a huge loss, which was that Guns on Campus bill was passed and signed into law. And suddenly we went from 2 local groups to over a dozen. 2 of our volunteers ran for office in 1, And this year we completely stopped the gun lobby's agenda in the state of Arkansas, which is a huge success. So I think being willing to fail is important too.
And a great way to I mean, that's how you learn, right? I mean, you learn from experiences, both good and bad. And before we let you go, Shannon, you've been described as the NRA's worst nightmare, and good for you. But what have you learned about the NRA in this effort, and what do the rest of us need to know?
Well, the NRA is weaker than they've ever been in their entire history. They're under investigation for many reasons. Their ties to Russia, their mismanagement and misspending of members' money. And all of this is unfolding right now, and they appear to be imploding, although I would never count the NRA down and out. We are stronger than we've ever been as an organization and as a movement. In fact, we outspent and outmaneuvered the NRA in the midterm elections. And if we really want to make a difference, we need to get off the sidelines and get involved before 2020, because the NRA will not be able to play the way they've played in past elections. They don't have the money. They don't have the bandwidth. And this is a very crucial juncture for this issue in America.
Shannon Watts, founder of Moms Demand Action, author of Fight Like a Mother, How a Grassroots Movement Took on the Gun Lobby and Why Women Will Change the World. Shannon has been our guest today on the America's Democrats podcast. Shannon, we appreciate your time and wish you the best of luck moving forward. And hopefully we can get back with you and get some updates down the road.
That would be wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you for joining us. And this is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen to this americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats. But we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.
Social Security measure. I believe that we must pass legislation to provide medical care.
This is our tradition. When our grandparents came to America, it was the Democratic Party which said, welcome. It was the Democratic Party, the party of Roosevelt and Truman and Kennedy and others, who said that America belonged to all its people, not just a handful of the rich or a few giant corporations. That's why great leaders like FDR fought so hard for Social Security, and why JFK stood up to the insurance companies and their Republican allies to get Medicare. It's not just one thing, or one time, in one place. It's about a whole history of standing up to the Republicans and saying someone has to be on the side of regular working people in America, whether it's defending Social Security or just the way your loved ones are treated on the job. That's what the Democratic Party is all about. And that's why this message has been brought to you by the Democratic Party. Working people like you and me.
Paid for by 21st Century Democrats. Not authorized by any candidate or candidates committee. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Coming up next, Red State Revolt and the power of teachers' strikes. But first, we turn to Jim Hightower, America's #1 populist, for his common sense commentary.
Congratulations on that nice pay raise you got last year. A 7% hike. Wow! After 40 years of stagnant wages, that uptick can help you pay off some of your old credit card bills or get an upgrade on your 10-year-old pickup. Oh, wait, you say you didn't get such a raise? Oops, my mistake. It was the CEOs of corporate giants who reported to the Associated Press that they enjoyed a median jump of 7% last year. And since their paychecks were already king-size, that amounted to an extra $800,000 in their take-home pay, jacking up their total yearly income to $12 million each. Bear in mind that median means half of the corporate bosses grab more than 7%. For example, David Zaslav, honcho of the Discovery Television Network, had a 207% boost in his pay, raising his total take in 2018 to $130 million. These lavish payouts to top-floor bosses, combined with a miserliness toward rank-and-file employees who actually produce the corporate wealth, is creating an untenable income disparity, stretching inequality in our land of egalitarianism to the snapping point. The pay gap between aloof CEOs and typical employees nearly doubled last year at a range of corporate giants, from PayPal to CVS Pharmacy, and it tripled at Discovery. AP's recent survey found that compensation inequality is now so extreme that a middle-wage employee at most major corporations would have to work 158 years to make as much as his or her chief executive was given last year alone. To amass as much as Zaslav pocketed in 2018, a Discovery employee would have to work 989 years. This is Jim Hightower saying, when you hear corporate chieftains gloat that our economy is booming, ask yourself, a boom for whom?
Need an antidote to the progressive blues? Want some good news about how grassroots folks are rebelling against the corporate powers and winning? Well, here's an easy-to-swallow pill for you, the Hightower Lowdown. Hightower's monthly newsletter will give you the lowdown, even as it lifts you up. It's 4 pages a month, jam-packed with facts you can use, actions you can take, and Jim's own Texas humor, all for only $15 a year. To become a lowdowner, go to hightowerlowdown.org.
This is the America's Democrats Podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. In 2018, in some of the reddest states in our nation, teachers led a series of walkouts demanding not only better pay for themselves, but better schools for the children they teach. Writer Eric Blanc embedded himself in this unlikely and powerful rebellion for an inside view of a movement that has the potential to rebuild working-class politics in America. And we say hello to Eric Blanc, who writes on labor movements past and present. Formerly a high school teacher in the Bay Area, he's also the author of Red State Revolt, The Teachers' Strike Wave and Working Class Politics. Eric Blanc, thank you so much for joining us today on the America's Democrats Podcast.
Thanks for having me on.
Our pleasure to have you with us. Among other things, this book offers a correction about how we think about red states and the often talked about red-blue divide. How is this wave of teacher strikes reshaping the way we understand red state politics?
Yeah, I think really this red state, blue state narrative is very superficial at best. And it's peddled both by Republicans to give themselves some sort of legitimacy, but also really by the Democratic Party establishment as an excuse to not take bold progressive action and to not really foreground demands on behalf of working class people. And the reality is that polls for years have shown that there's a progressive majority in all states of the country, not just on economic issues like Medicare for all, but even on social issues like immigration rights. And so what we're talking about when we look at these strikes is the expression of a sentiment that already existed but just wasn't given an outlet, because if you have to choose between Republicans and corporate Democrats, a lot of people check out. Most people don't vote for Republicans in red states. They vote either for Democrats or they don't vote at all. That was the case across the board. But the strikes that we saw gave an outlet to really what is a very deep and legitimate anger against the way things have been going for decades in this country.
Now, as you have often noted in your journalism about teachers' strikes, these are not actions limited to issues such as teacher pay. These are strikes about the soul of education. Why is this so important?
Right. Well, for a long time, unions have been on the defensive, and part of the reason for that is that unlike these teacher strikes, the norm for unions has been to sort of act or be seen like a special interest just out for themselves. And so, as you mentioned, these weren't strikes just about pay, but in fact were strikes not just for the soul of education, but really on behalf of students and parents as well. So one of the crucial demands in almost all of the strikes was the call for more funding for schools. You had teachers go on strike in places like Oklahoma or Los Angeles, not demanding any new pay for themselves. And they were solely fighting for things like more funding, more nurses, more counselors, smaller class sizes. And so they were able to push back against this narrative, which is so prevalent when there's strikes, not just in the public sector, but generally, that workers are just greedy and looking out for themselves. And they made it clear to the public that actually what this was about was providing better public services, both for workers and for parents and students as well. And they were really successful. The polls overwhelmingly showed that the public backed the strikes because of this.
Now, Eric, you spent a great deal of time on the picket line with striking teachers to do the research for this book. So who did you meet, and did anything surprise you about that experience?
Yeah, so I really did spend a lot of time in these strikes. I was in all of the major strikes since 2018, and one of the really surprising aspects was that even in red states, you did see that relatively small groups of organizers, often radicals, often people who got politicized through the Bernie Sanders campaign, who were very young, might have considered themselves socialists. They played this outsized influence. It's not as if the bulk of the strikers themselves shared their politics, but you did see this real dynamic where young teachers who had first gotten politicized through the Bernie Sanders campaign and maybe who are members of the Democratic Socialists of America played a leading role in places like West Virginia and Arizona. The West Virginia strike itself really began, the organizing for that began in a study group of the Democratic Socialists of America in Charleston in 2017, where teachers started studying what strikes had worked in the past. And you saw that again in Arizona. And it does really say something about, I think, this new moment and the new battle within the Democratic Party for what direction things should go, that you have these younger crew of radicals playing an important role in the strikes and in trying to shape the course of politics in their states.
And as you have alluded to before, when we're talking about the red-blue divide, it's not in just a red state or a blue state. It's in any state, in every state. You've written that many of the teachers you met were disillusioned with their unions as agents for meaningful change. Do unions deserve this lack of trust? And what's the message you hope unions will hear from these teachers?
Well, yeah, to a certain extent, the mistrust is deserved. I think that the reality is unions have been in decline for decades. And a big reason for that is that unions have turned away from some of the methods of organizing in politics that they relied on at their most successful, which is to say that for the last, 4 or 5 decades, unions have almost exclusively oriented towards lobbying the Democratic Party instead of building up their own independent power, instead of really putting forward an independent political perspective that can inspire and excite and involve educators or other workers. And so, yeah, the distrust is understandable because if the union's not delivering and if the union's not trying to get you involved, then it's understandable why people check out. But I think it would be a big mistake to look at the union somehow as this third party separate from the workers or the teachers, because one of the inspiring things about these strikes was that organizers on the ground made a case to other school workers that actually, rather than just complain about the union, people needed to understand that the union was them, that we are the union, and that the union was really only going to be as powerful and as effective as rank and file workers made it. And so that transformation of the union happened because people consciously started going to meetings, they consciously started challenging some of the old strategies, and they were largely successful in pushing the unions and the union leaderships into a new type of politics, a more confrontational politics with the bosses, with the corporations, with the politicians. And it worked, and we saw it work.
We're speaking with Eric Blanc, who writes on labor movements, past and present. He's also the author of Red State Revolt, The Teachers' Strike Wave, and Working Class Politics. Eric, in some ways, these strikes are very specific to the states in which they take place. To what extent do organizers communicate across state lines, and are they creating potential for a nationwide movement?
Yeah, clearly there are differences in the types of organizing that you're going to have to do in a place like Arizona, where there's no collective bargaining and you don't have the legal right to strike, compared to a place like California, where you do have these rights. And so the rhythms and the dynamics are distinct, but really what's at the core of all of these struggles is a fight to defend and improve public education. That's both for workers and for students. So there has been quite a bit of communication across state lines, and there's been a lot of cross-fertilization and inspiration. The West Virginia strike almost overnight evaporated the sense of powerlessness that has really seized working people and educators also across the country. People saw West Virginia strike and win in 2018, and that spread like a wildfire across the country, and it's continuing. And there has been active discussion between teachers in these different states. A lot of the organizing and communication has taken place over social media. You have these Facebook groups and Facebook chats. You have a lot of solidarity expressed through group photos where teachers in one state will take a photo with their coworkers in solidarity with strikers elsewhere. And then there's also been networks created things like Labor Notes, which is a left-wing sort of network of educators and other working people across the country, where people can come together to talk about what's worked, what's not working, how can we support your struggle, what are the lessons being learned. So yeah, there's definitely a national movement, and we're starting to see some repercussions of that in the national discourse around public education, which is definitely shifting in the direction of the unions and strikers rather than the kind of corporate reformers who dominated the airwaves for such a long time.
Well, and there's also a narrative that often emerges when teachers strike, that they're letting the kids down. And that speaks to the needs for teachers to win over the public. Have teachers in this recent wave of strikes been able to do that?
Yeah, definitely. So as I mentioned before, part of the ability for them to do that so successfully was because they raised demands on behalf of students and on behalf of just improving public education generally. So there was that aspect. But they also took really proactive steps to do things like provide free lunches for students who depended on the free lunch that would normally, or breakfast actually even, that they normally would receive at school, because a lot of working class students in all of these states really were dependent and are dependent on schools to be able to eat every day. And so when you have a strike, it poses a real challenge for a lot of working class families, like both where do you house students and how are they going to get their nutrition. And so one of the things that the strikers did in a lot of the states is that they proactively started organizing child care centers, maybe in churches or in community centers, to be able to provide a space for students to go during the strike, and also to provide food and hand deliver them off. And so that parents knew that it was actually teachers were fighting on behalf of their students and weren't hurting them, contrary to what the media kept on saying. But, people saw in their own experience who was actually out there defending their students. And I think that's one of the reasons why the strikes are so successful.
Mm-hmm. Now, a continuing theme in your work on covering teachers is the evolution of privatization in education and the role of billionaires in shaping how we educate our kids. Are Democrats doing enough to challenge this trend and champion the public in public education?
I think the first thing that needs to be said there is that the Democratic Party has been just as complicit as the Republican Party for years in the corporate education reform. You actually had more charters created under the Obama administration, charter schools, which are privately run but publicly funded entities. You had more charters under Obama created than any administration before or since. And in fact, most privatization where it's gone furthest has been in blue states, not red states. So not only have Democrats not done enough generally to combat this trend, but in fact, they've often, and for the most part, unfortunately, been on the wrong side. That is starting to change now. There's definitely a shift where being openly pro-privatization and openly anti-teacher and anti-teacher union is no longer kosher in at least the mainstream of the Democratic Party. But it remains to be seen whether that type of rhetorical shift will be matched in action. And so you can kind of get some sense of the contradictions, because even in a place like California, which is a deep blue state in which there's a supermajority of Democrats and it's completely run by Democrats, the pushes for things like a moratorium on charter schools for a fully public school system have been, for the most part, not implemented yet. There's been some steps forward, but despite these calls for a moratorium on charters, the actual action backing that up is still very limited. And on a national level, so far only Bernie Sanders has called for a national moratorium on charter schools. So I'm hoping that the strikes and Bernie's new plan for education will become the norm, but it remains to be seen whether it will be implemented in action.
And Eric, before we let you go, is there a playbook in this story that other workers can use? I mean, even those outside the public sector?
Yeah, I think there's two big points I would make. The first is strikes work. If we're going to take back this country and take on the billionaires, we need a strong labor movement. And the way you build a strong labor movement historically and still today is you need to be able to use the strike weapon. By withholding our labor, we're able to shut down any institution, any corporation. And if we don't lean on that type of tactic, we're not going to be able to reverse course for working people generally. So that's the first thing. The second thing is we need to challenge this narrative of scarcity, this idea that there's just not enough to go around, that there's not enough for public schools, there's not enough for quality health care, there's not enough to save our planet. And I think that the reality is, and the statistics, demonstrate it, and the strikes have won the public to this, at least when it comes to education, that there is enough to go around. But the problem is that the billionaires and the corporations aren't paying their fair share. So in order to provide, a decent life for the majority of people in this country, it's possible, but it's going to require that the corporations and the rich, we have to reverse these decades of tax cuts to them, and we need to create a much more equitable prioritization of resources. But that's going to be a huge struggle because those in power don't like giving up their privilege in general. And so I do think that it's possible to change that narrative and to fight back, but it's going to take a lot more organizing. Hopefully, though, the strikes are just a first inkling of what we can see more broadly amongst working people.
Yeah, amen to that. Eric Blanc writes on labor movements, formerly high school teacher in the Bay Area, and he's the author of Red State Revolt, The Teachers' Strike Wave, and Working Class Politics, joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast. Eric, thank you so much for your time. We look forward to having you back again with us soon.
Great. Thanks for having me.
And we appreciate your time. And this is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Make your contribution to keep the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, on the air, and help elect stand-up Democrats. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. And now Bill Press launching a new podcast with Congressman Jamie Raskin as his first guest.
Last week, Robert Mueller surprised all of us. The Sphinx spoke. Suddenly, for the first time in 2 years, he came forth with a statement, kind of summing up his report. What was your takeaway from the Robert Mueller report, Congressman?
Well, the takeaway was that he delivered 11 episodes of presidential obstruction of justice, maybe 5 or 6 of them, which just looked to be dead to rights, prosecutable, indictable, which is why there are now more than 1,000 former U.S. attorneys and federal prosecutors who are running around the country saying we would have indicted anybody else in this circumstance, but the president is not indicted when he's sitting in office by the Department of Justice. And that was precisely the point that Mueller was making. He said there's one reason we didn't indict the president, because of the DOJ policy that we don't indict a sitting president. And so he obviously took on the attorney general there, and he tried to dispel that thick fog of propaganda that Barr has left over the country with the ludicrous no obstruction, no collusion mantra that he and Trump have been advancing everywhere they go.
You're a constitutional lawyer. You taught constitutional law. Do you agree with Robert Mueller that Office of Legal Counsel opinion is constitutional, that under the Constitution, you can't indict a president?
Actually, I do not agree with that. There's nothing in the Constitution which says that the president cannot be indicted while in office. There's a handful of ragtag OLC opinions, Office of Legal Counsel opinions, which were requested by presidents, and then each one built on the last one until you get this little precedential authority for what it's worth, which is not much within the executive branch of government, which is they think that you can't indict a sitting president, but there's no holding from a court saying that. There's nothing textual in the Constitution like that. It defies common sense. I mean, are they really saying that if the president committed murder on Fifth Avenue, that he couldn't be indicted while in office? It just doesn't seem logical.
Right. Do you see the Mueller report as an impeachment referral to Congress?
Yeah, I think that's the way that Mueller is articulating it. I mean, he keeps going back to it. Remember, he seems like he's really mad. He wrote 2 letters of protest to Barr about his misstatement and the propaganda-like choreography surrounding the much delayed release of the report. And he said, you're confusing the American public. This is leading to the confusion of the public. And so his point was that it's not up to us in the Department of Justice. The reason he said, I'm not pronouncing upon it is because of this policy in DOJ. And I don't think it's fair for me to say, even though we don't indict, I'm just going to go ahead and say it because, how could the president defend himself? Of course, the president does have the biggest bully pulpit in the world. He could have defended himself. But in any event, one understands the logic of what he is saying. But he kept repeating, this goes to Congress. They have other constitutional remedies at their disposal. So I think what he was saying is, if we could have absolved him, we would have. If we could have exonerated him, we would have. We didn't. Here's all the evidence. Look at all this evidence. And now it's up to Congress to act.
Do you believe Donald Trump has committed impeachable offenses?
Almost certainly. Yeah. All of the episodes of presidential obstruction of justice are things that just jump off the page as impeachable offenses. When the president tells the White House counsel, go and fire the special counsel, I don't like what he's doing to me, I don't like what he's looking into, and tell everybody it's because there's a conflict of interest, that is in itself obstruction of justice. But we saw it publicly when he said to Comey, you got to drop this case against Flynn. He's a good guy. Let it go. And then when Comey refused to, he sacked Comey. So there are repeat instances of that are set forth in the report. I mean, think back to pre-Trump time, right? Pre-Trump, when we all would have thought it absolutely extraordinary, almost unthinkable, that a president would try to interfere in any criminal investigation, in any prosecution, call up the prosecutors and say, leave this guy alone, leave that guy alone, or bring charges against this person and that person. That's extraordinary. But to do it in a case involving you, I mean, that's like unthinkable or unfathomable. And everybody's wandering around, scratching their heads like it's some sort of great philosophical mystery. Is this an impeachable offense? Of course it's an impeachable offense. Now, just because you have an impeachable offense doesn't mean you necessarily impeach. And that goes to the nature of impeachment. I mean, impeachment is a mixed question of law and politics by constitutional design. If it were just supposed to be a question of law, it would have been put in Article 3 with the courts, and they would have looked at it, and it would have been brought in that direction. But it was left to Congress. And so we have to look, okay, is it an impeachable offense? And then B, do we actually impeach? That requires us to set impeachment on the table vis-a-vis everything else we're trying to do: lower prescription drug prices, protect pre-existing condition coverage, deal with the international situation, and also represent our constituents. And so that's why it is this complicated mixture of legal, political, constitutional, moral, ethical questions that we're involved in.
Right. It seems that is, most people see, that is the decision facing Democrats in Congress right now.
And Republicans too.
And Republicans too. Sadly, not enough Republicans part of the debate yet. And oversimplifying, there seem to be two schools. Speaker Pelosi says, let's keep up with the legislative agenda, hold these hearings, gradually build a case for 2020 against Donald Trump. And there are others who say we have to start the impeachment hearings right away, because if we don't, we're endorsing Donald Trump's behavior. Do you fall in either camp? Should we begin impeachment hearings right away?
Well, again, we got to define our terms here. There's a difference between an impeachment inquiry and articles of impeachment.
Good.
Articles of impeachment...
Please, a lot of people don't understand that. Please explain that.
Articles of impeachment are the end of the process. It's an indictment. Think of impeachment as an indictment, and that's why there is this handoff coming from Special Counsel Mueller. He said, we don't indict in the Department of Justice a sitting president of the United States. Congress can indict a president of the United States through the impeachment process. Now, it's not a criminal indictment in that the president doesn't go to jail, but it's a removal from office. And there's a big stigma attached to that as well. But that's the end of the process. The beginning of the process is an impeachment inquiry. Now, some people have said that when I point this out, that it's a distinction without a difference, I'm trying to lure people into it. Nonsense. Most impeachment inquiries in the House of Representatives have not led to articles of impeachment. A majority have not gone all the way. So it's a real thing. When we start an impeachment inquiry, we have to say, okay, what are the different areas of criminality we're investigating? Obstruction of justice would be one. Contempt of Congress would be one. Abuse of power would be one. Violation of the Emoluments Clause would be another one. There might be others that are brought forward. We would set up those categories. We would have investigators looking into all of them. We would conduct hearings into them. And then at the end of the process, we would say, do we think that there's sufficient evidence? Do we think there's abundant evidence? Now, the Constitution is also silent on what the specific standard of proof is. Is it beyond a reasonable doubt, which is the criminal standard of proof? Is it by a preponderance of the evidence? Is it somewhere in between? That's a little bit murky, but we would clearly have to see sufficient and compelling evidence of criminality before we would decide that we wanted to write articles of impeachment and vote on them. Now, even if we did that, we voted on the indictment, and then it, say, leaves the Judiciary Committee, goes to the floor, and say the full House votes on it. Even if we did that, that just kicks off the process in the Senate. The indictment would go from the House, which is operating here like a grand jury and a prosecutor, over to the Senate, and the Senate would conduct a trial. And they need 2/3 in order to convict. So this is why I say to people, an impeachment inquiry is not impeachment articles. Impeachment articles is not an impeachment trial. The Senate's got to conduct that, and a trial is not a conviction. And so a conviction is not even a panacea for everything we need. So even those of us who are calling for impeachment inquiry should not be over-promising in terms of what it gives us, but it does put us on a path to a constitutional solution to the current crisis of the Republic.
And what is the difference between an impeachment inquiry and what's going on now? Because you do have some of these questions being looked at by various committees.
Yes.
Financial and Oversight, and the Oversight Committee, and the Intelligence Committee, and the Judiciary Committee.
It's a matter of a formal assignment and definition. It would be the House of Representatives saying, we've seen enough evidence to believe that there may be impeachable offenses. We would like a formal inquiry where presumably the House Judiciary Committee, it could be a select committee, but the Judiciary Committee will investigate in a systematic and organized way all of these offenses, as opposed to a dozen investigations going on in different committees and subcommittees all over the Congress into different kinds of misconduct.
Right. Now, there are people who make some pretty strong arguments that that's rushing into something. And one of their arguments is, just to play devil's advocate for a bit, is you yourself said it goes to the Senate. You know that Senate Republicans under Mitch McConnell are going to dispatch this very quickly and not vote to convict Donald Trump. So in the end, he's going to he'll still be in office, and you would have gone through all this angst for nothing.
Yes, that might be right. It might also be wrong. If you go back to the Nixon investigation, people thought that neither the House Republicans nor the Senate Republicans would be moved. But investigations have a dynamic of their own. Evidence comes out. Smoking guns arrive. People learn things. And, already we've had one Republican, Justin Amash, say, I read the report, and I'm sorry, I found the conclusion irresistible that there's evidence of high crimes and misdemeanors in there. Read the report, he urged all of his colleagues. So good for him that he did that. But he won't be the only one. There will be others who will have a real crisis of conscience about this, and will have to ask whether they can put their constituents and their conscience and their country above their political party. And it always happens in a situation like this.
On that point, Robert Mueller did say read the report. We know that most Americans have not and will not read the report. Should Robert Mueller then testify in front of Congress, even though he said he'd rather not?
I think that the sentiment among my colleagues on the Judiciary Committee is that he should testify. He should come in. You saw how his statements on Friday were like a dam breaking in terms of public opinion. It's one thing to have the report out and then to have all of these disputed accounts of what's in there. It's another to have the special counsel himself, a decorated war hero and lifelong Republican federal prosecutor, come up and say what's in the report, and that we would have exonerated the president if we could have. We could not do it. The only reason we didn't indict him was because there's a policy against indicting a sitting president. So I think that had an electrifying effect on public discourse. And we know that lots of members have come out for an impeachment inquiry since he did that.
One of your colleagues, Congresswoman Shelley Pingree from Maine, said that even if Robert Mueller were to come in to the Judiciary Committee and just read out loud on national television the pertinent parts of the report.
Yeah.
Mission accomplished.
Yeah, well, the country's had a lot of discussion about redactions, but what we really need is some excerpts of the most dramatic and riveting findings and conclusions that are in there. So most people are not going to read 450 plus pages, but people would read 10 or 15 pages of the critical summaries, precisely what Attorney General Barr tried to suppress when he first got the report from Barr. And Barr wrote 2 letters of vehement protest against what Barr was doing. I mean, there is a very special place being reserved for Attorney General Barr, given what he did to America over the last few months.
One other argument, of course, is that if you proceed with an impeachment inquiry, it automatically sucks up all the oxygen, and the pledge that Democrats made, which is we have a legislative agenda, we're going to get things done on prescription drugs, on minimum wage, and all that other stuff, just disappears. Can't get it done.
The truth might be the reverse. That might be true, but it's also the case that everybody is focused on the one hand, the corruption, the obstruction, the lawlessness, the defied subpoenas, the refused witnesses, the documents not turned over now. And then also people are focused on the president's tweets and, so it may be the reverse. It may be that by creating a centralized, focused, disciplined, methodical impeachment inquiry that we are able to cabinet away from everything else we're working on, and we are able to take back the reins of public discussion and the narrative about what the president has done to us. Now, admittedly, it's a tough environment with the president tweeting 24/7 and so on. But look, in the House of Representatives, we've been enormously productive legislatively. We passed the Equality Act for civil rights for gay people. We lowered prescription drug prices. We're taking on corporate money in politics. We're trying to have new disclosure rules for campaign finance. We are, protecting people's pre-existing condition coverage. I mean, we're doing all this stuff. It's all sitting over there in the Senate. There's a huge stack of bills that McConnell is not taking on. That's the obstructionism that we're facing. That's the problem. So I think that McConnell and Trump are in an obstructionist league together. The president is obstructing justice and obstructing our constitutional values, and McConnell is obstructing legislative progress. We've got to fight back. My grandfather, who was in politics, used to say that duck hunting is a lot of fun until the ducks start shooting back. We've got to start firing back and making clear that we're not going to let them get away with all of these violations of the rule of law.
And I guess one final argument to run by is that, and I think if were Speaker Pelosi here today, she might say, yeah, but let's look at what happened last week. There were 3 judges in 1 week who ruled against Donald Trump, who ruled in favor of the Democratic committees in Congress. So, this process is working right now.
That's absolutely right.
Keep going.
Well, but that's right. But we're not just keeping a scorecard of judicial victories. What we're winning on is cases where the administration is withholding evidence from us. So we're trying to get evidence. But what's the evidence for? The evidence isn't just to have evidence. The evidence is to figure out what they've been doing to our country, what they've been doing to the Constitution. So, the irony of that argument is the more evidence we actually get, the more evidence of high crimes and misdemeanors we assemble.
That's all for the America's Democrats podcast. Thank you to all who made today's show possible. Shannon Watts, Eric Blanc, and the entire Bill Press team. And thank you for listening. If you liked what you heard, please get involved in our efforts to keep this show going and to elect Democrats who are bringing the party back to its roots. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. And be sure to find 21st Century Democrats on Facebook and Twitter. And leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. For the America's Democrats podcast, I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Join us. Support the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, and help elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles with your contribution today. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.